Oh, thanks, Ellen. Well, joining us today is Marty Mix, and Marty Mix is the co-chair of the Firearms Study Committee and an outgoing state league president when the study was adopted in 2019. She has a wealth of knowledge on this subject and is really skilled at being able to discuss the things that we're going to discuss today. She's currently the president of the League of Women Voters of Golden Valley and has served in every board position except treasurer since joining the league in 1976. So hoorah, that is a wonderful accomplishment. She finds serving on study committees challenging, but very interesting, whether it's state or local. Her league's local observer program motivated her to serve on the park commission and then 8 years on the city council. She is a retired social studies teacher and taught for 21 years in the Osseo School District. So welcome back. And thank you for spending so much time with us, Marty, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Colleen, and thank you all for showing up today. I think it's an important topic, so I'm glad that you are here too. Elizabeth, am I co-host so I can share the screen, or can I just share the screen? And
you are a co-host. You should see a green share screen button at the bottom of your screen.
I do. All right, so I'm just gonna get to our PowerPoint, and let me just get it started. Sorry, it just took me a second here. All right. The report, Firearms in Minnesota, was not an easy process, but we did get it down to a more concise report, and you will see that we just have the 8 consensus questions. I don't know, I'm assuming that everyone here has, no, I should not assume. The consensus process is where a league committee will study an issue. You should have the pros and cons we discuss, and it's really trying to get at a consensus of what our members want. We don't want to have just a simple majority because we could really alienate a lot of our members. So it's a process that we want to make sure that, you know, we come to some kind of clear supermajority on each of these policy positions. I have kind of made it so that it's a little simpler to understand the 3 things that we accomplished at council last year. And there were 3 changes or updates to our position. And one was including ghost guns as defining firearms to include ghost guns. Currently, there is a rule, an executive order that the ghost guns are defined as firearms. The reason that this is important, it means that anytime you have a frame or receiver that is created, frame or receiver is kind of the guts of a gun, and it only takes some simple, maybe an hour of drilling, up to 2 hours, to get your gun all put together from a kit. And if you don't have ghost guns, if you don't have these frames of receivers defined as firearms, you don't have a serial number on them. So the idea is that if a person makes their own ghost gun kits, they'd have to go to a dealer and get a serial number put on it so it could be traced in case it was ever involved in a crime. E-trace is a more recent kind of phenomenon where the FBI can trace a gun through its serial number of at least the first sale. The next change was to change the wording to say that firearms would be, the firearm purchasers would have a license, or transferees. Transferees means that it may not be that the person bought it, but that they received it as a gift. So that there should be some kind of process for that. And the other was universal background check. That was the intention of the original committee. But when the Brady bill passed in 1993, universal was no longer the issue. It was only only licensed federal firearm dealers had to adhere to the requirements of the Brady bill of, you know, having a background check for all purchases of firearms. So, and these are our positions, and some of them, you know, I would like to see some of the wording change, but like one of them, like here, local government may regulate firearms more strictly than state. We can't do that. Since 1985, we've had preemption laws, meaning that the local government can't create a their own separate laws other than to say no discharge of firearms in the city. And there was some discussion in the committee about stiffer and or mandatory penalties for people who commit crimes with firearms. That is something where some felt that that was created problems and others were happy to see it. So, not every one of these did the committee all agree on too. So don't feel that you have to be in lockstep with every thought there. The consensus process, we are hoping to get all leagues to have turned in their ballots or their consensus forms by mid-February, hopefully February 1st for any individuals. And delegates are going to approve this. We have a convention coming up in the first weekend in June in New Ulm. So that is, hope that they'll have a kind of hybrid process there, so not everybody has to drive out there to New Ulm. This is a quick overview of firearm deaths, and the reason I felt that this graph was so important is that until I started researching, I thought that most of firearm deaths were murders, and that's not the case. It is suicides. However, you'll notice that there's been times like here when we're talking in the year a little before 2000, there was a large gap. Our murder rate had gone down dramatically, and it's not an accident that it happened. There was a very large omnibus crime bill that was passed in 1994, and this bill included more money for police, more money for community policing, more money for violence interruption, more money for a lot of things that would help reduce crime. Now, back then, in the mid-90s, a lot of the murders were actually sometimes involved with, gangs. Today, we don't have as an easy a situation to unravel because there are now more like social media type of disputes rather than organized gangs, things where you can say, okay, this is organized. We know these people are involved in this gang. No, it's kind of more individuals, and it's a lot of, things that are a little harder to trace because, as I think John Choi, who's the county attorney for Ramsey, said that in their county, they found that there were connections to some criminal activity, but it would cross borders. It wasn't just within St. Paul. It would be in Minneapolis or, down to Bloomington or something. So they really had a harder time tracing that. Our suicide rate in general has gone down. It was 7.7 per 100,000 back in 76. And of course, we had also the results of the Vietnam War, and we had a lot of vets coming back who had really suffered a lot of post-traumatic stress. Let's see, I should go back, sorry. I have this very sensitive mouse now. I'm gonna have to use my keyboard instead. So in 1990, we had 35,000 gun deaths per year. Now it's about 44,000. The rate still is not any higher. It's because our country has grown quite a bit from 1990. And the Second Amendment back then had not been interpreted to be an individual right, but more as, for a well-regulated militia, there should be the ability, kind of like your National Guard should have the ability to have firearms. There were very few privately owned assault rifles. Well, they didn't have that many that had been made, actually. Few permits to carry. Gun casualties were exceeded by traffic deaths. I will note that in today's world, we have the drug deaths, the overdoses. Over 100,000 people died of drug overdoses. And they were not, it's not like they were intentional, but these were accidental. And that's why Narcan, one night in Crystal, Minnesota, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, they had 6 people overdose on fentanyl, and they were able to use their Narcan kits to save 5 of those 6 people. So that's the kind of things that are going on that we don't realize, that if the police didn't have Narcan kits, we would be seeing even more deaths. Second Amendment, reinterpreted as an individual right. And there's a rise in threat now from domestic armed militias who are anti-government, increase in mass shootings. And of course, mass shootings, it depends on how it's defined, but in either way, either case, no matter the definition, there has been an increase in mass shootings. Guns are, it says guns safer. Actually, they're more accurate and deadly and cheaper. I don't know why I didn't even see this yesterday. Guns safer. They're actually more deadly. But today's dollars are cheaper. Overview of firearm violence. This is where we talk about the suicides. In these numbers, it's a closer number right now. This is a national number. In Minnesota, when we started this research, the 2018 numbers, 77% of all gun deaths were suicides in Minnesota. Then we had COVID, the killing of George Floyd, and the increase in homicides. Well, Minneapolis, I shouldn't have to say anything to Minneapolis League members. You know, it's happened in your own community, and it's happened spread into other communities around here. Firearms are used in 75% of the homicides. There is no one definition of mass shootings. So if you look at FBI statistics, it said that there have been 60 mass shootings last year. Well, if you look at the gun violence archive, it says there are over 600 mass shootings. It's how it's defined. FBI does not include the killing or the shooting of 4 or more people, excluding the shooter, if it's in the home. So domestic situations where they're going to a home where there's selling of drugs, or there might be some kind of other criminal activity. Those actually are the majority of our mass shootings. So again, family, and that is actually the majority is family members, and then it's followed by criminal activity for mass shootings in the home. Now, when we talked about that the firearms are decision by Heller, just established that individual right to bear arms, not a collective right, to a well-regulated militia. But they said it's not an absolute right. So at that time, there were already 4 categories of people who could not have possession of a gun. And since then, it has increased. Several more categories have been added, including misdemeanor sentence of a person for domestic violence. And it also includes stalkers now. So we have a lot more people who are in that category. This is not all nationally. Minnesota probably has the most stringent when it comes to categories of people that can possess a gun legally. And then McDonald versus Chicago applied the Heller to state and local laws. So it's not just federal laws. They also identified the right to bear arms, not just as a Second Amendment right, but as a privilege of citizenship, including the 14th Amendment. The Bruin decision is actually, Bruin is the county or the state attorney for New York, and that's why the name Bruin there. It's the New York Pistol and Rifle Club that had this case against the state of New York. New York had had a rule since 1913 that you can't have a permit to carry unless you prove reason to have that permit, and you had to keep your gun actually in your home. And so this extended the individual right to self-defense in public spaces. So now you can carry your gun, in your car, going to different places. Now, the federal government had already said that if you go across state lines and you have a permit to carry, the federal law applies. And that's why, you can go from here to South Dakota with a gun in your car because of that federal law. And now with the Bruin decision, a lot of states, and they're not that many, will probably have to change their handling of permit to carries from a may issue to a shall issue, SHALL. federal legislation since 1990. By the way, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, still called the ATF, is responsible for the enforcement of federal firearm laws. They originally started in there was a Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco back in late 1787, 1788. So we've always had some kind of enforcement group. It just expanded to firearms after the National Firearms Act, and then explosives were added. And I'm not quite sure when that was added, but I think it was somewhere in the late 60s when explosives were being used in, bombing churches, that kind of thing, the kind of anti-government and pro-civil rights groups in the late 60s. Federal laws preempt state laws. And the Brady Act was a big one in 1993, and it required a background check, but left that loophole for unlicensed sellers. So that only applied to if you had a license, a federal firearm license. And this meant that gun shows, you could go to a gun show, you can buy guns online without having a background check. And I think I'm misspeaking. If it's a fully, if it's a full firearm, if it's done on the internet, it's supposed to follow federal laws. But a kit, again, without that, is not defined as a firearm, or was not until just last year, without that serial number on the frame or receiver. And then, of course, I spoke about this big omnibus bill, the Violent Crime Act. It also banned semi-automatic weapons, but that expired in 2004, or I should say assault weapons. And then the Protection of Lawful Commerce Act protected gun manufacturers from civil lawsuits, meaning that, you can't sue the, Colt or the Arm Right Company if you had a mass shooting. It could only be only lawsuits against firearm dealers, or if their product doesn't operate safely or accurately as it was billed to do. So in other words, if it's shooting off accidentally without even touching the firearm, you can sue the company. But otherwise, if there's not a defect in the product, you can't sue them. Minnesota legislation says 1990. I'm going to stop. Is there any questions so far? Or did I say something that didn't make sense? Because I never know. I might have said something that didn't make sense. If you see any hands up, I can only see just like 6 people here, so I don't see a hand up yet. So no Minnesota city can have regulations stronger than state laws. I see Judy Soundbecker had a question.
Yes, hi Marty. This is a wonderful presentation. I was just curious, back on gun deaths, did you look at any data on accidental shootings, like a child finding a gun in a home and dying that way?
Yes. And actually, the good news is there's far fewer deaths of children than there were before we had the Safe Storage Act in Minnesota. I think there's more awareness. In fact, when you go to buy a gun here in Minnesota requires that you have a big sign saying what the requirements are, that if you have a person under 18 in your house, that you have to make sure that you have the gun safely stored where they cannot reasonably get access to it. And if there's access to a gun and the gun owner was not careful, there can be criminal penalties for that. And sometimes when you're looking at data now, they will make it seem like there's more children getting guns because they're starting to include 19-year-olds. And as we're seeing in the news, we see 14 to 19-year-olds carrying guns, carjacking. So the concept of it's under 18 would reduce the number of people having guns or getting killed accidentally, finding their parents' gun. Let's see. Any other questions? Okay. So we do have, I'm sorry, I went good, but we do have more people that are prohibited from having guns. And Minnesota, to qualify as a child access prevention statute, you have to make gun owners liable if death or injury results from negligent storage. And some states have a stronger law, and that's the one that we have on consensus, is whether we should require safe storage statutes rather than just negligent. And we'll get to that when we talk on the consensus. And one thing I was surprised about when I was researching, we have a permit to purchase that's needed to buy a handgun. And also, if you were to buy an assault weapon, a semi-automatic weapon, you also need a permit to purchase. And I should have said semi-automatic military style weapon. That kind of sets us apart from a lot of states that don't have that. That means that there's no background, they're not doing background checks that are a little bit more full and complete like we have for the semi-automatics. And then a background check has to be completed within 7 days or it's granted by default. And same with the permit to carry, except that is a 30-day period because that requires more background. It's not just the FBI's data, but it's also going to, in Minnesota, checking with Health and Human Services, what kinds of issues there are, or what kinds of, are they on the docket for appearing in a court for some kind of felony accusation. Let's see here, or felony charges. I don't know. I just didn't think of that word for a second. So the permit to carry assumes eligibility in Minnesota unless law enforcement proves ineligibility. So in 2003, Minnesota went from a may issue state, meaning that the police, or that you had to prove to the sheriff that you needed a gun for your protection. And it took that from a may issue to a shall issue state, meaning that if you apply for a permit to carry, unless the sheriff has some reason why you shouldn't get it, you will have that automatically within 30 days. And in our interviews, there were several sheriffs that were a little concerned about how judges were more likely to say, if they flagged a person, the judges were a lot more lenient in saying, sure, you can have a permit to carry. So that they had their own concerns about leniency and letting people have a permit. 2% of our people who have permits to carry are involved in some kind of criminal event with their firearm. 2% doesn't seem like a lot, but now that we have so many people with a permit to carry, that can have an impact. And again, we've got the new technology. I think the thing here is the interchangeable parts add to firearm capacity, meaning you can have those auto sears added to your firearm to make whether it's a rifle or a handgun, to be an automatic. And again, that new concept of having self-manufactured guns that you can make in your own home and easily convert it into a fully semi-automatic weapon. And or it also, you can get the 3D diagrams on how to do a printing of a gun yourself. Plastic guns were actually not, they were kind of a joke about 10 years ago. I mean, if you shoot it off, that was it could practically explode in your hand, and it was not accurate. They're getting better, and that's why it's more of a concern and why we want ghost guns to be also watched as carefully as firearms are. And these are now our consensus topics. And I hope you've read the report. If not, as we go along, you'll see the page number listed for each of the topics. But before I go on to the first consensus question, any questions at all? And again, if anything didn't seem right, and again, I can't see the gallery, so if you have a gallery view, if you could see, if anyone has a question, let me know. Okay, so the first question, should Minnesota enact extreme risk protection order laws These used to be called red flag laws, but they're called extreme risk protection orders. Partly it was a more of a political thing to make it more not seeming so negative. And that's on page 12 of the report. So extreme risk protection orders are usually done through law enforcement who will petition the court because they know how courts operate. Whereas some states can have family who can have that done, but quite often the family will go to law enforcement. And most states also have law enforcement or one of the county attorneys to take that process through. Some states allow social workers, some states allow school personnel. And in any case, there's usually a law enforcement usually ends up doing it. And one of the things, it's just a real quick aside, we have people who are mental health professionals who are saying that these extreme risk protection orders are hard for them to handle.
What?
They're often, dealing with maybe they are. Hello? They're dealing with having to leave.
What?
Huh. Can I be heard, or is this a person talking to another one in the house?
I think it was just some background noise. I think you can go
Okay,
ahead, Marty.
okay, not a problem then. So they can't leave their place of work at whether it's a mental health facility, at the hospital, to go driving to a court to testify. So they're saying it would be nice if the courts would allow them to, have a social worker do it, somebody who can leave the facility, or, why not Zoom it, to be able to give testimony that way so that they don't lose so much time. It's also a weight on law enforcement because waiting at court and driving to court takes time. There's extreme risk protection orders can give a temporary ban on firearms possession and purchase. And this is longer than we have a 72-hour hold, but during that time, yes, they are being held and they don't have access to firearms. But after the 72 hours, they have their guns, they can buy guns, and there's nothing that stops them from accessing a firearm. With ERPOs, that's a kind of a certain form of extreme risk protection order, they cannot buy a gun and their name would be flagged if they were to try to buy a gun in the state. And it's most effective at preventing suicide, the most prevalent form of gun violence. And it also helps, it helps to prevent perhaps the mass shootings. 19 states have passed ERPO laws. Senator Ron Latz has tried a couple of times here to get ERPOs in Minnesota and it failed. We'll see what happens this year. When we were interviewing police and sheriff, they didn't have much support for several of the questions we asked them for new gun laws, but they did support extreme risk protection orders. And the Association of Police Chiefs has that on their docket for lobbying at the state legislature too for that. The pros, of course, it must be approved by a judge with due process protections. That was one of the concerns that police had. They wanted to make sure there was due process. And states that have adopted have seen a reduction in suicides, homicides, and mass shootings. Sometimes it's hard because we don't have that much data to see how can you prove that it hasn't happened when this is just based on threats. And I should have taken out, says a large majority of American support. It's not that easy. If it was that easy, it would have passed, but it is like probably around, it's around 68–70%. So, and it is effective at preventing the gun violence of suicides. The states who have enacted it have seen reductions in their suicide rates. And then the cons, of course, it may violate the Bill of Rights, Second Amendment, or the Fourth Amendment, because if the police were to take their their guns, that seizure, and the Fifth Amendment is the right to due process. But I think a well-written law doesn't impact the right to due process. Oh, I should say, what is different from extreme risk protection orders from what we have with the 72-hour hold? Extreme risk protection is different in that it's based on threats. Like if you have a student in the school who is threatening to shoot, they'll have a list of who they're going to shoot. That would be a perfect reason to have an extreme risk protection order to make sure the guns were taken out of the possession of that student, or, if their family could make sure that these were locked up elsewhere so that there would not be that kid bringing their gun to school. Okay, should Minnesota enact extreme risk protection order laws? And this is where I guess the poll is done, right? So do you see the poll on your screen right now? The poll question?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, here are the results from the first poll.
Okay. All right. So did everyone see the results? Has everyone seen the results?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't just the co-host. Okay, then the next question on to that. Should Minnesota provide funding for community-based violence intervention programs and strategies? That's on page 12 of your report. So right now we have the cost of gun violence is $153 to $173 billion a year, from the cost of hospitalization, from the cost of lost wages and work. And of course, we always hear about the people that are murdered, but the people who are injured can have lifelong disabilities from the shootings. CVI uses community outreach to disrupt violent cycles in areas of most need. And there's all different types of them. And of course, each community knows what's probably best for their own community. But some provide street outreach workers to create social pressure. Many of these street outreach workers were people who had been had some pretty rough areas that they grew up in. And, if they grew up in the area and they are a positive force, that they can actually be very effective. They provide support and training for people who are in need. There are a lot of social services to change the lives if the person will let them, and then hospital appeals to victims and family to lessen retaliation. That means, when a person goes in with a gunshot wound, that they're also going to they or their friends will retaliate, which is then going to lead to another shooting. So if they can break the cycle at the time of the first injury, they can be more effective. These have been used in violence interrupters in some large cities in Minnesota. It's with mixed results. It depends who you have as your staff who are running it. Brooklyn Park reported immediately that they saw fewer police calls because they had their violence interrupters at a couple of apartment buildings that were having a lot of issues, the people within the apartment with each other. So it did reduce the calls. They have, though, said that they have had such an increase. They went from a pretty safe community to having some murders, and they didn't have murders every year before this last couple of years. And Minneapolis had fewer homicides this year using several programs. And it's not that much less, but anything less we'll take it. And the Minnesota benefits from evidence-based research on effective CVI is one of the advantages of it, and police would have support from other social service groups. Already, I think many police departments in the metro area now are getting access to social workers who are following up on, calls to the police where they're having some disputes. And so I don't know how it's working. I think Minneapolis just started embedding social workers, right? I know St. Paul had it for several years now, several meaning like 3. Okay, and then of course, the costs are there. It is additional funding is needed, and there can be high costs up front getting things rolling. And it also, you have to determine which approach is the best to use. So far, it looks like intervention with law enforcement involved actually can be very effective, but it's difficult and controversial because those who are involved in some of the shootings don't want to be around the police, but it can be helpful. So now we get to the consensus question. First, any questions on what I was saying? Again, it's morning and I'm not a morning person. Any questions at all? Okay, then are we ready for the poll?
Here are the results for question 2.
Oh, yeah. What's your question?
Oh no, here are the results for question 2.
Okay. So 1 abstained. All right. And then question number 3, should Minnesota back on the other one, I'm glad you supported that. It's there is a lot of money given out for community violence intervention from the federal government recently in this last one of those last big omnibus bills, but it's not going to reach the smaller cities. It will definitely, I think Minneapolis will be getting money, but would other cities? Probably not. So that's where it's important to have the state, and the state did set aside money in 2 years ago, I think it was. So it will funnel down, and hopefully we're going to see the results sooner than later. This one is a bill that John Marty has been promoting for the last few years with very little support from the other side of the aisle. Now, I don't know if you've been to the Capitol, but if you have a sign, saying vote for ERA or something, you're not allowed to bring that up there because they've got sharp edges on those signs. And a stick handle is a problem, but I had just a sign, and I was not allowed to bring that up there. We had to put everything off outside the gallery. So while stick handles or signs are deemed dangerous and are banned from the Capitol, any individual with a valid permit to carry may bring a handgun inside with no prior notice, screening, or sign-in required. The number of handgun permits have skyrocketed during this time and when violent rhetoric and demonstrations have increased. And Giffords Law Center tracked over 50 instances since 2020 of armed protesters using firearms to chill free speech and harass and intimidate legislators. As an aside, I'm from California originally, and when the Black Panthers came to the state capitol with their rifles over their shoulder and their ammunition over their shoulder, the state of California banned open carry of weapons, and that happened quickly. I don't think that we've had an incident in Minnesota, but that it certainly did happen in Michigan with armed protesters actually dealing over the COVID requirement for or different COVID policies that the state of Michigan was enacting. Some states don't allow for open carrying of firearms in their capital because it can chill debate. With Minnesota, if you have a permit to carry a firearm, we allow open carrying and concealed. And the rationale for that was quite often if you have a handgun and somebody can see it, you know, it's then termed open carrying. And so they just don't want to have anyone who has a permit to have people upset if they can see it. That they should know that that's legal if they have that permit to carry. Minnesota law allows those with a permit to carry a firearm to carry it in any public space that is not a restricted government building. So this particular consensus question referred to the Capitol building itself. Now the pro for this would be firearms can intimidate witnesses and legislators. If sticks are dangerous, guns should be considered dangerous. And I think last night someone said you can't have an umbrella in the chambers. And the Capitol often has crowds, which could be a setting for a mass shooting. And the con is firearms could protect people, or carrying firearms is our Second Amendment right. Another con would be, where does the person store their firearm? If they're carrying it and they're outside, you know, they have to go inside the Capitol, they would have to have some kind of place to safely store everyone's guns who was coming in. And that's actually not a reason to do it, to oppose it. It's just a reason that it could slow things down. Okay, any questions on that? Are we ready for a poll? I haven't heard any questions. Okay. Well, that was fast.
Here are the results from consensus question 3.
Okay. And then our next question is question 4. Should Minnesota adopt stronger safe firearms storage laws? And that's on page 15 of our report. Currently, we have negligent storage law, which is, you know, which has been doing a good job, but there still have been cases where we're seeing that a toddler is getting a gun, or older sibling has shot a child. And sometimes there are people who maybe don't know what the laws are. You know, if you don't have, if you haven't bought your gun legally, because if you go to a firearm dealer in Minnesota, they require that sign saying that if you have a person under 18 in your home, you have to safely store your firearm so that they cannot get access to it. We do have a criminal penalty for unsecured firearms. Just a kind of funny note again in our research of interviews with police and sheriffs, one police officer said, this is the hardest law to enforce because you can't go into people's homes to see how they're storing their firearm. Safe storage laws amp up negligent storage laws a little bit by requiring owners to store firearms in certain specific ways. And it can vary from requiring trigger locks on a firearm. And it could require that you have your gun stored in a separate locked case from ammunition. And 6 states require this. 6 states actually have the safe storage laws. It's effective against suicide because it takes time then to get from your ammunition to your gun. And, you know, they say that there are many suicides that are more impulse, that if you have a 10-minute period between when you first think about it and your ability to find something to kill yourself, that person quite often would not do that if they thought it through for 10 minutes. The pro for this is it's effective to prevent suicides and homicides, and it's effective to prevent child access to firearms. The con, especially if you're living where the sheriff or the police couldn't get to your place, they often will say you should have your own gun to protect yourself. That slows down your ability to protect yourself. And there's no way to enforce what happens in people's homes. And we already have a child access prevention law. And yeah, it's inconvenient to access guns when needed. Any questions on that? Any questions? Okay. So are we ready for the poll?
Here are the results for question 4.
So 2 people didn't vote, right?
One person had to leave.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to vote.
I think the other person might be you.
Oh, it might be. Okay. The minutes
I'm
on
not
that-
voting either because I voted last night.
Oh, okay, that explains it. Okay, should Minnesota add those on the terror watch list to the prohibited purchaser category? And that's on page 15 of the report. This is one that Mary Louise Groh, the co-committee chair, really felt strongly that our state should have that. There currently is only one state that prohibits those on the terror watch list from getting, from buying a firearm. And the reasons for this are that, recently domestic terrorism caseload has exploded and it poses the greatest threat to national security. And those on the terror watch list right now are free to buy and own unlimited firearms in the US. A large percentage of individuals on the watch list have cleared background checks and received approval to buy, because they don't have access to that watch list. They only have the FBI's record and they do not check the watch list. Now, this is different than the fly list. The fly list is one that has really been under a lot of scrutiny because, people were on their way to the airport and then they find out that they can't get out of town because they're prohibited by the fly list. Minnesota has 11 statewide hate groups. 3 terror incidents were tied to militia movements in Minnesota. And the reasons to not have this is that this would be a violation of the Second Amendment right to own guns, and a violation of the Fifth Amendment right to due process. This is one where those on the terror watch list have no opportunity to contest their inclusion in court. And, you can be on the watch list if you are, let's say you're best friends with the leader of ISIS, you'd be guilty by association. And the list is secret. There's no due process on that. There could be unfair profiling of religious, racial, or other ethnic groups. And the terror watch list may have multiple issues, but the no-fly list certainly did. And they have improved that from what it was originally, because quite often people, like if they're Muslim, they might have the first name of Muhammad and they might have similar last names. If they're new to if they came to the country, quite often they have the birth date as the default of January 1st. So there could be some errors, and there certainly were at the very beginning of the no-fly list. And I don't know if that also applies to the terror watch list, because we don't know who's on the terror watch list. But New Jersey has had it so far, and nothing, there doesn't seem to be any, I didn't read anything negative about that in New Jersey. Should Minnesota add those on the terror watch list to the prohibited purchaser category?
We've got a question from Judy.
Yeah, hi Judy.
Terror watch list? No, they're on the terror watch list. And the reason I ask is
if they want to kind of keep it secret that they're being watched, excuse me, and they go to buy a gun and they can't because they're on this list, does that cause a problem for like a law enforcement operation that might be following a group?
That's the first time I've heard that question. That's interesting. I can't answer that. I think, that could be their thought. I don't know, because, I even was asking law enforcement about that, and they don't really, share any information because they don't want to have anybody that is who might be working undercover in one of those groups at risk. So I don't know.
Nancy here.
Mhm.
I had the same question, and it seems like a very serious issue in terms of security of undercover workers. And also someone goes to a gun store and I would assume when they're doing the background check that they would be surprised to learn they can't buy. It seems like it could lead to all sorts of problems.
Well, they would, no matter what, if you're going to purchase a gun, most likely the unless your town doesn't have a chief of police, the permit to purchase, the background check is done by the police chief, and or it could be the county sheriff. And they have there's usually a lot of different reasons, but you couldn't get possession of your gun until the police have okayed that you have passed it. And they don't do just the simple background check that's done at the gun dealer store. So if it is the first time, if you get a permit to purchase, it's good for 1 year. A permit to carry is good for 5 years. And a permit to carry also allows you to buy guns without any permit to purchase at that point, because you've already passed a lot of different hurdles to get that permit to carry. So there could be some issues, but I think that most probably wouldn't be too concerned about why, because they wouldn't tell them why they're not getting that gun that day. They would just say, you have to wait till we hear back from the local police department. And that also makes me realize that there would have to be some process for how they do the background check. It would have to be maybe even done at the sheriff level. I'm not sure, because whether they want the police chiefs to have access to that. But I don't know.
We also have a question in the chat from Sue. She's asking if we have any idea the number of people on the terror watch list.
Oh, it's a lot. It's a lot. I read where there's, over 1 million, because the terror watch list is including international citizens as well as domestic citizens, US citizens. So the largest guest I saw was 7 million. The lowest was about 1 million.
I have a question on that. I don't know if it's pertinent, but if somebody is not a citizen, if they're like, if say somebody's traveling in this country, can they just walk into a gun shop and buy something?
No, you have to be a citizen of the United States.
Okay.
There are some, if you are here legally with a green card and you have a permit to live here, yes, you can buy a gun.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. That not being a citizen was one of those prohibited purchaser categories that was added later on. Any other questions before we do the poll? And just remember, on our committee, not everybody was 100% in agreement with any one of these questions. I think we only had a few that were of 100% agreement, but there was, you know, questions on each of them, on 6 of them from some of the others, including myself. Are we ready for the poll? Okay. So everyone saw the results? Okay. So ready to go on to the next one? Should Minnesota require state licensing of firearm dealers? Now, this was one that some states have, and the rationale for that is that there can be firearm dealers that are not honest and who may not be careful about following all the rules. Some may not want to keep an inventory of who has bought guns from them. They're required to by law, but they are only in, the federal government made a law based on one case in New Jersey where there was a firearm dealer who was actually being kind of harassed by the ATF, and agent was going to their place very frequently, checking on their follow through, and they won their case. And so then Congress passed a law that they could not be investigated more than once a year. And that in Minnesota, if we had a state licensing of firearm dealers, we couldn't exceed that once a year. But the reality is, because there's so few ATF agents for the number of firearm dealers, we have over 50,000, you know, firearm dealers, and this is federally licensed firearm dealers, that the reality is you're lucky if you're even if an agent checks out your place more than once every 10 years. And there have been some dealers who've said it's been 20 years and they've never had ATF contact them, you know, to see their books, etc. Now, Minnesota, it's not like this is the most important thing at this moment, because Minnesota doesn't have quite the concern about dishonest dealers, but we do have some. And how they can figure this out is how quickly a gun is sold in a certain state and how quickly it ends up being used in a criminal case. So Minnesota doesn't need, when they do this tracing of where they came from, Minnesota's not as, it's not like we're, you know, a big red flag alarm, but it is something that some states are finding. It's a way to prevent us from becoming vulnerable to rogue dealers or dishonest dealers. So we don't have a state licensing system for dealers, but it does mandate certain security measures for places of business selling firearms, such as Minnesota requires that when you have a gun shop, you have to safely store your firearms so that if someone breaks into your shop, they can't get all the weapons. And 9 states and Washington, D.C. require licensing of firearm dealers. 7 more states require state licenses for the sale of handguns and certain kinds of firearms. State licensing of dealers also, there's a penalty for dealing without a license. It's 5 years in prison and a fine up to $250,000 or both. And the resource limitations prevent ATF from properly overseeing all of its licensees. Again, they don't have that much staff, And they've got so many firearm dealers, and it's quite easy to get a federal firearm license if you have a clean record. Giffords Law Center reports dealers are inspected only once a decade. Federal license is needed to deal firearms with a profit motive. In other words, if you are just selling, from your personal collection, you don't need a license. But there are some people who are very interested in old curios, and they will get a federal license just specifically for that. There's 9 different categories of federal licenses, including one license where you can get for dealing in explosives, which is a little scary. There'd be stricter certification process, the routine inspections and annual accountability for inventory. They'd make sure that there was some once a year inspection. Background checks for all employees, requiring that employees are also adults and pass background. And because right now it's just the dealer themselves that have to pass all that background check. And there would be required, liability insurance. Security measures such as surveillance cameras, safe storage, and alarm systems could be enforced, because right now there are not. And the cons, it's another layer of bureaucracy. So for states to administer and oversee, it'd be more cost for dealers to pay a license fee for both the state and the federal. And there always are going to be ways for people to get around the law. That would be another con, but that's true on every single one of these possible consensus questions. Are there any questions on this before we go on? Any questions at all? Okay. So we're ready for the poll? Yeah. Anybody needing more time? I guess, okay.
If anyone missed the poll, they can give me their vote in the chat as well, and we can make sure that counts.
And then for question 6 that we're at, should Minnesota, sorry, we're on to the next one. 7, should Minnesota fund firearm violence research? Right now, the federal government has funded some firearm violence research. They gave money to the CDC to dole out grants for firearm violence research. That had kind of stopped for a while. I guess maybe it's on my thing. Public policy should be based on research that we have that's good research. The Dickey Amendment did chill gun research for 23 years. And it left a void in research. And the reason for that it chilled gun research is the concept was any of your research that would be used to lobby against firearms would then make it so that you couldn't get any, grants. And so now that they've clarified that the gun research is just, you only can do the gun research, you can't use any of that money for lobbying or for promoting a point of view. More research would help root causes, or would help understand root causes and potential solutions to gun violence. And funding would support research to develop evidence-based solutions to gun violence epidemic. And the pros, Minnesota doesn't have an adequate database to see how we could reduce gun violence. Locally collected data would aid public policy decisions. Local level is better for collecting data. Minnesota would develop a rich database. And obviously, we don't have as much firearm violence as many states. I think we are always in the lowest 8 states for both homicides and suicides. Research is costly. Research should be better done at federal level. back to a pro, though, I forgot that, you know, this way, you know, maybe local community colleges could be given grants, doesn't have to be a huge amount, but grants to actually have their students involved in research as well. So it could be adding a little bit more, a little more richness for the students' education at community colleges or state colleges here or the University of Minnesota. And that is it. Are any questions on this? And again, our consensus questions are focused on the state because we can't lobby at the national level on a state consensus. That has to be adopted by the National League. So, should Minnesota fund firearm violence research? Okay. All right, so it looks like we've got 14 out of the 15. And I think we're one of the 15. Okay, so the next one, should Minnesota, this is one that might give us a little bit more discussion here. Should Minnesota oppose the passage of a stand your ground law? Stand your ground laws are different than what we currently have in Minnesota, which could really, by precedent, we have a castle doctrine, meaning that, you know, when you're in your home, you'd have no duty to retreat before using deadly force if you're in your home or yard. Some states do include a place of work and occupied vehicles. Now, stand your ground, which is number one here on this one, you have no duty to retreat from situations before resorting to deadly force. You might recall the case of Trayvon Martin being killed by this man Zimmerman, and he was on the phone with the police, and the police are even telling him, please retreat. And he kept following Trayvon. Trayvon turned around and did jump him. And so then he pulled out his gun because he felt threatened because Trayvon Martin was on top of him. And that's why he got off. But had that been in Minnesota, he would have had no grounds to keep on creating a situation that could resort in deadly violence. He would have had to stop following him. So we have a duty to retreat from a threatening situation if we can do so with complete safety. And again, because it's precedent and it's the Minnesota courts that have really clarified that we don't have to be retreating from our home. That case in Minneapolis where a person had shot somebody in their unattached garage, the garage was considered to be part of their home. So we have actually expanded the concept of castle doctrine. But outside of our home, if we're in the parking lot with somebody, we have a duty to retreat. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. We can see that 38 states have stand your ground laws, 30 by statute and 8 by case law or precedent or jury instructions. And we are one of the 12 states that impose a duty to retreat. What has been found, and you'll notice that the states, oh, here I keep touching that mouse and that throws things off. But where firearm violence is at the lowest rates are actually most of these states that are in dark blue. So the question is, are you more likely to have stand your ground because there is more violence, Or does it create more violence when more people feel emboldened to shoot? Because what's happened is they have seen that rates of firearm deaths increase, I should say homicides increase after stand your ground laws are passed. You don't know whether, this research was actually based on a time when our firearm violence was increasing over this period of 2019 to our current time period. So it's very, that's why we need more research on this. The pro, meaning that you oppose stand your ground laws, is because citizens can use deadly force when they reasonably perceive a threat, whether or not that threat ultimately turns out to be genuine. And these laws are sometimes called shoot first or get away with murder laws. That would be, of course, people who want to not have them. And stand your ground laws require untrained civilians to make difficult, stressful decisions about using deadly force against an attacker. One aside, I noticed in Minnesota, we had 2 cases. One where in St. Louis Park, there's a man who had his gun, he had a permit to carry. A woman in the parking lot coming out of the grocery store was had a gun to her head. She was forced out of her car, and she hadn't, they pulled her out, but her seatbelt was still attached, and she was about to get run over by the car, and a man pointed his gun at the hijacker. He didn't shoot him, but the hijacker quickly got out of the car and ran to another car that was waiting. His little buddies were waiting for him, and so he went into that car, and no one was shot, but that man did pull out his gun. In another case, a person was in the process of being carjacked, and he shot at the carjacker and hit somebody else on the street, on the sidewalk across from it, because, shooting a gun at quickly, you have a hard time shooting accurately. Even police will accidentally shoot people, and they are in, they have pistol range training quite often. So they're always supposed to be working on their accuracy, and people can't always be accurate. And even though these laws are made to help citizens defend themselves, some studies show that these laws may increase murder rates. Actually, Rand Corporation, which does a lot of very good nonpartisan research, found that it did increase the murder rates. And according to another study, stand your ground laws are enforced differently based on the race of the shooter and the victim. If the shooter is white, they're more likely it'll be quickly understood. But if the shooter is Black and the victim is white, they might, it's questioned as to whether there actually was a situation of stand your ground. They'll assume that it was actually the person of color who was initiating. The con is residents have a right to defend themselves from attack anywhere. It empowers citizens to defend themselves with legal force, which may deter criminals. Police can't be everywhere, and criminals may think twice about threatening a victim if they fight back. The law clearly defends the right of a victim to self-defense, so in a life-threatening situation, a victim doesn't hesitate or wonder if they are acting within the law. And stand your ground laws strongly shield the victim of a crime from liability, meaning they cannot be sued by their criminal attacker. Actually, when I was doing research and finding, training classes for permits to carry, there are a lot of them that would offer also liability insurance, for if you're out with your gun on the permit to carry to protect you in case you shoot somebody. So should Minnesota oppose the passage of a stand your ground law? Any questions, by the way? I forgot to ask that before I went on. Anyone see any questions out there? Okay. Are we ready to vote? Okay. So it looks like we've got the participation. All right, well, that is the last slide.